listening to TMI for the week of March 4th, 2019.
Today's guest, Jean Giroux, first studied conventional psychology at the U of T and continues now at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. What do we call you?
John. I get Jean, which is nails on a chalkboard for me.
What about Jean?
I've gotten that one too.
Yeah.
Mostly from Filipino people, believe it or not. I've noticed.
What about Ni?
No. Never heard that one.
Yeah, but Jean Ni.
Well, that's my mom's nickname for me since I was a kid.
Oh, okay.
It used to be Coco, C-O-C-O, like Coco Chanel. I don't know where that one came from. And then when I started playing soccer when I was, competitively when I was about 8 or 9, someone started calling me Johnny. My mom caught onto it, loved it, thought it was really cute, and then has been calling me that ever since.
It's a name.
It's a name. My full name is Jean Nicolas, hyphenated, because I grew up in the era where every French Canadian had a hyphenated name, so that was my iteration.
So the Jean Ni isn't that far of a stretch from Nicholas.
No, that's the idea. Condensed. 2 syllables instead of 4. Nicolas, yeah, 4. Jean Nicolas.
Keep it, don't do that.
Okay, sorry.
That's the producer, he's a prick.
Yeah.
And your last name?
Giroux. Giroux.
What are you doing with yourself? You're studying psychology. Psychiatry or psychology?
Psychology, not psychiatry. Psychiatry is, no, it's not an evil profession. Psychology because I had a number of issues growing up. Emotionally, I was diagnosed with severe obsessive-compulsive disorder when I was about 14 or 15, and I wanted to get to the bottom of it. Conventional psychology failed me. Maybe I just didn't have the right therapist. I'm not trying to, lump the entire industry into the same category, but the methodologies didn't get deep enough for me.
Was that a psychiatrist or a psychologist?
They were both. The psychiatrist would always try to prescribe. That is the panacea. Not saying that they all have malevolent intentions, but that's just what their training is. You have many reformed psychiatrists coming out now talking about how indoctrinated they were when they were in the field of strict psychiatry.
Would they choose to medicate versus using talk therapies?
Well, it's interesting. I was reading a couple articles yesterday that talked about how when they do, first of all, direct-to-consumer marketing is now allowed. It's the U.S. and New Zealand are the only 2 places in the world where they call it DTC is allowed, especially for psychotropic medications. And the idea behind that is that they just have to, first of all, they way underfund talk therapy. It gets maybe 5% of the funding. It's tough to sell and market talk therapy en masse.
And what's DTC?
Direct-to-consumer marketing. And these are, heavy medications. These are medications with potentially long-standing effects on people. They're playing around with your neurotransmitters and your biochemistry, and they're not really well understood, nor is the brain really that well understood, despite what mainstream neuroscience will have you believe.
Just anecdotally, I was thought to be a hyperactive child. And I think in the end it was just that's how young kids are.
Yeah.
And we went to a psychiatrist and he prescribed something. I can't remember. I don't know what it was.
What year would have this been?
Gonna guess 74 or 5. And my mother had me discontinue it after a very short time. But as soon as I started that medication, I gained weight. and remained quite fat kid until puberty. And that actually had a profound effect on me. I was quite happy-go-lucky. I was a normal kid. And I really think that, I guess it would help if I knew what the drug was. My mother took me off it, and I guess I was lethargic. I don't know what I was. But
what did it do to
really
you?
did. I think it changed my metabolism, or maybe it changed how who knows what it changed.
How did it make you feel, though?
I can't remember. It was really 7 or 8. Maybe it was 9.
Wow, that is astoundingly young.
Maybe 8 or 9. And that's when kids are going crazy and nuts and don't stop. And anyway, but and I can say just in the course of my life that being fat between the ages of 10 and 15, that had a major effect on me as a
Worse
kid.
than your hyperactivity.
And I don't even think I was hyperactive.
Unlikely.
Yeah. So
Kids aren't really allowed to be kids. They're railroaded into societal expectations of how they should behave.
Well, I was also a single child, and it's possible I was a handful for a single mother. Mm-hmm. That's possible. Mm-hmm. Now, in your case, isn't it that OCD is sometimes you just grow out of it?
I haven't heard that.
Oh.
Obsessive compulsive disorder can be pretty intractable, especially if you don't ever gain consciousness of what you're doing. I certainly didn't when I was in my early teens, and I would behave in really bizarre ways. I would repeat mantras aloud, mantras that would attenuate my anxiety for a period of time in front of people. People were like, what is going on with this kid? I was constantly tense, and I just had a chronic fear of dying or a chronic fear of our home being robbed. That particular phobia goes back like into the single digits in age. Really interesting one that I haven't analyzed fully, but
all kids have that. I mean, when I was 9 or 10, you might count your steps, or you had a preference for even numbers. I think every kid does a little bit of that. And in fact, I think that all psychological conditions are present in all of us, but in very small amounts. And would you agree with that?
I believe in the collective unconscious, and that we all share a psyche to some degree. We all contain psychological elements in all of us. It just depends on the individual, their upbringing, their experiences, and their outlook, and their genetics and environmental influences and so forth. So they express something based on those experiences. But there's likely an element in it of everybody. Everybody has neurotic behaviors to some degree, some more so than others. People border into psychosis. But it depends on the degree to which it affects you, the amount of distress that you have. So if something feels out of place to you, if you didn't take X number of steps, or you didn't touch the door handle a certain number of times, then what are you thinking is going to happen afterwards? Yeah. Do you think the roof is going to cave in? Do you think you're going to walk out and get hit by a car?
So I know in my case it was just out of boredom, out of mental boredom, it didn't have a connection to an anxiety.
Right. So that's the difference. This would make me tense to the point where I could barely function. I could barely leave the house on some days.
Not the behavior wouldn't make you tense. In fact, the behavior would alleviate the tension.
To some degree, but things with obsessive compulsive disorder, the rituals or mantras have to be enacted perfectly, whatever your interpretation of perfect is. And if you fall short of that, then you have to start over again. And if you have to keep starting over again, the anxiety can build up and it can be pretty intolerable.
Another interesting thing about being a 9 or 10-year-old is the sensation of time. 2 minutes can be a month.
You've noticed that? I've never paid attention to that. That's interesting.
When I was a kid, if you were sitting in the principal's office or whatever, those 2 minutes were just months and months and months. Anything. Especially if you didn't like being bored.
How often did that happen to you?
Pretty regularly. It was not every day, but regularly. Yeah. Like part of being a bored kid. So there's my hyperactivity.
I hear you. I was there a fair amount myself. I almost got expelled a number of times from elementary, middle, and high school.
Yeah?
Yeah.
For what?
Just being distracted and...
Disruptive?
I have a knack, just like my mother, for finding people's sore spots and pressing them really effectively. And I just got a huge kick out of that. So there are a couple teachers that I targeted that I thought were disingenuous or full of themselves, and I would just press their buttons all day long and made them mad like nobody in the school had ever seen before. So sort of a badge of honor in some ways in retrospect.
It's pretty daring and bold, and you're not afraid of the consequences.
I was afraid of my parents' wrath, but my parents went to open houses and met with the teachers, and they could see why I was behaving that way sometimes, so they cut me some slack.
That's funny. What made this hyperactivity, this OCD go away?
I'm not sure that it has entirely. The anxiety underlying it is pretty much there. I meditate a lot. Dedicated the last couple years to deepening that practice. I was really skeptical of it. I also hated it because you have to sit there and be with yourself. And when you first start out and your mind is just bouncing off the walls, it can be pretty intolerable.
Do you have trouble getting to sleep?
I did. Pot solved that issue, which I'm now paying the price for, trying to wean myself off of it. It's definitely affecting my sleep. But the obsessive-compulsive itches are still there. It's just whether or not I'm willing to scratch them. And now that I'm aware of them, and now that I'm more secure in my sense of self, I'm able to let those go and just see them for what they are, which is what meditation basically teaches.
Seems to me the common thread in a lot of mental disorders is the self-awareness. And it's because the very tool that you would use to measure your own behavior is the tool that's been affected. So over time and after different forms of therapy, maybe the therapy was gaining the ability to judge yourself in real time. So if you felt anxious and you were going to behave in a repetitive behavior, you could see it. Like, I know people who are diagnosed and they're very much most of the time aware of their issue, and yet it continues to plague them. And you would think if you were self-aware of it, you would see yourself in the moment doing it and stop. But this is...
That's the crux of cognitive behavioral therapy, which I imagine I performed some variation of on myself. I went to CBT therapists when I was a teen, and there was just so much fucking homework every day. It's like I'd go to school for 8 hours and then have a binder as thick as a cinder block to bring to my CBT sessions and have to do homework afterwards. And it was like, that is the last thing I want to do at the end of a school day. So I just didn't pay attention to the therapist by the end of it and stopped going.
That's interesting, the homework, because I was talking to somebody the other day, and I was saying, a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists use audio recordings. And it's not to record the sessions. It's essentially to create courses that maybe have 10 parts. And just like a book and a teacher, maybe somebody records something and you're sent home with it, and maybe you discuss it during your next episode, or small presentations to other professionals. That would have been, I wonder if that would have been easier if you had gone home with something to listen to versus something to...
I don't think I could listen to anything back then. I don't think I really learned how to read till I was 25. Like really read.
Okay.
Like not just gloss over the words and finish a book and not know what happened in the book or what it was talking about. It really, like, that's how sped up my mind was.
Mm-hmm.
And, my body reflecting my mind. I was just a ball of anxiety and stress, and unwinding that has been a trip.
I've postulated that we all have, I don't want to say this way, but voices in our heads. There are monologues. I don't mean separate identities in your head, but there are messages you're sending yourself. Sometimes if you're depressed, it's the constant barrage of negative messages. If you're anxious, it's a bunch of messages that emphasize your anxiety. And if we assume we all have that, then it's that certain people, it's very loud. So you can't focus on reading when you were younger because there's another monologue going on in your head that's louder than the stimulus that you're trying to input into yourself.
Yeah, well, I'd say that's pretty accurate.
Okay.
That's the first part of meditation, is paying attention to that voice,
Right.
And seeing how it governs you, seeing how it influences you, and seeing how much you believe in what that repetitive refrain is. And oftentimes we have a negative bias. Typically, most people think the vast majority of their thoughts negatively. And what the part of the mindfulness tradition is centered on not believing the voice in your head,
Mm-hmm.
because it is just a conditioned voice and is something that you've been conditioned to believe. And once you can step off that track and observe it from sort of a bird's eye view perspective, you're in a sense liberated from it.
I've often wondered, this is something I've done for myself. So because once a month or whatever, your brain is racing. You're not going to be able to sleep. And the thoughts, I'm old computer days, but it's a baud rate. It's a speed of data per second. And so I've tried, I don't know what kind of therapy this fits into. So I think of a horse and I slow the horse down. And I slow it and slow it and slow it until even the words I'm doing my internal monologue with slow down to as if you had slowed a tape down. And then another analogy is you put blinders on the horse and you realize you're the horse. You're controlling yourself. And this horse isn't out of your control. You can slow the horse down. As an analogy for myself, so if I'm thinking that way and I'm keeping track of the number of thoughts I'm having per minute, let's say, I can see the horse. So you can detect that each thought that comes in, and a lot of them are negative, not so much, but okay. I notice the pace of it, and I can slow the horse down, and I can feel the words coming into my head at a slower rate. And then if you imagine you put blinders on the horse, anyway, that's something that's
an interesting visualization practice.
Yeah, it's I think there's certain forms of therapy that use that kind of visualization of mechanical, just like taking your problem, putting it on a mental piece of paper, and physically crumpling it in your mind in slow motion and throwing it across the room and getting it in the garbage bin. I don't know what kind of therapy that could be, NLP. But
a lot of meditative practices use visualization because it's effective. It works and transforms your biology when you're in that state. So it's the one caveat to that is I'd say you ultimately don't have that much control over your mind. We don't know where thoughts come from. The more you try to control it, typically, the thought of controlling a thought is another thought. So you're still caught up in thought despite thinking that you're not thinking. So the mind's a really tricky thing. But that's an interesting practice. That's and if it works for you. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I bet. I mean, they teach it in cognitive behavioral therapy as well, as to imagine your anxiety as a beach ball and decreasing in your mind's eye, decreasing the size of the beach ball gradually till it's pocket-sized and disposing of it. And That never worked for me, maybe because I didn't buy into it, or didn't have the attention span to sit there and visualize that to its completion. But it does work for a lot of people. I mean, there's a reason CBT is as popular as it is.
Could you walk us through the schools of therapy? So there's Freud and there's Jung, and what are the major forms?
Well, there's humanistic. The form of therapy I'm most interested in at the moment would be, sort of the bedrock would be psychoanalysis. And that was Freudian. He was the first to study the unconscious. And then he influenced a number of people, and one of his main pupils was Carl Jung. And Carl Jung took it a step further and went into esoteric territory that Freud just didn't believe in. He was a vehement atheist and had no time for the numinous. And so they disbanded at that point, even though they were very close and agreed on a lot of things. Carl Jung was the first to talk about archetypes. And he talked about the collective unconscious. So instead of just having a personal unconscious, which is what Freud believed, he believed in a collective unconscious, as in a psyche, the human psyche that we all share. We're all part of a vast ocean, which is the human psyche, and we're an individualized point in that vast ocean. We're a wave in the ocean. But within that wave, you contain the entire ocean. So you just manifest it differently, sort of what we were alluding to before. There's humanistic philosophy based on Carl Rogers as the primary teacher. He was a pastor, and he was really interested in empathy and unconditional positive regard for your client, and just, you'd probably go there and feel really good talking to a guy like that. And then there's cognitive behavioral, which is more modern, which is more about manifest behavior, so less studying the unconscious impulses for a particular pathological behavior that's causing you distress, more about addressing it when it comes up and being more familiar with your thoughts. It's sort of a mindfulness meditation approach. And then there's Buddhist psychology, which I've also been very interested in, and Buddha was the progenitor of mindfulness. That was his baby. There's been lots of offshoots since then, and a lot of different modes of Buddhism that are practiced globally.
It's interesting there'd be a connection between a philosophy and a form of therapy.
Well, Buddha was the first to study the mind, to really study the mind and talk about how life is suffering intrinsically, and how to navigate a world of suffering through the Eightfold Path, which is sort of a behavioral, a way of conducting yourself in the world, a way of refining your mind, a way of extending your heart to people, loving kindness. And through the Eightfold Path, you reach nirvana, or liberation from suffering. And then you can be of great help to other people because you've sort of put the key in the keyhole and understood what life is about. And a big part of suffering is craving, according to Buddha. And it's hard to disagree with him. And craving is when you become attached to things, because the world is inherently made up of transient phenomena, things that are ungraspable. You can't grasp the last sentence you said. You can't grasp the last experience you had. All you can do is be there for the experience. You can't hold on to relationships, because if you hold on to relationships too tight, you're bound to suffocate your partner or make yourself miserable in trying to uphold or manifest an outcome that may or may not happen. And then you attach your sense of self-worth to outcomes of goals. And if it doesn't go your way, then you feel down about yourself.
If it fails or succeeds, it's a reflection on, I guess, you. And it's a loss if you fail at it.
And you feel invalidated. And I can't tell you how many times I've been down that road, being rejected and feeling unloved and unattractive, and that I would never find love, and that was my last hope at love, was the previous relationship. and realizing that it was that very behavior, that very fear that led to that outcome. What you fear most deeply, you tend to attract into your life, I've noticed.
In terms of what people are really wanting or craving or needing when they're seeking therapy, I thought an interesting thing happened to me the other day. And maybe this is a bit sexist. It's along the lines of sort of mansplaining. And maybe it's a bit stereotypical. But I would find that when you complain about something you're going through to the guys in your life, they're likely to bark back fix-its, suggestions, solutions, and you should. You should write a letter. You should. And so I was bitching and complaining about where I live. And they're turning it into a construction zone and on the parking and on and on. Like to complain. And I've been talking to this guy for a few weeks on and off about it as the story progresses. I'm sure it's not very interesting. And it was only when he said, that would really make me angry. I would really feel like my feelings were being ignored. I would feel... And he started, you could see the sort of anger in his face as he wore my situation for himself. And I immediately just lit up and was smiley and laughy, and it was, and I realized that's all I needed. Like, you could have saved 5,000 words. And it wasn't, I guess it was empathy, but it really what it was him reinforcing that which I was trying to describe, which is my feelings of being taken advantage of or getting the short end of the stick or whatever. And it's just so funny because, and all of his suggestions, if I listed them off, he's a lawyer. I mean, it's brilliant solutions, but they have no value. I just needed to be heard. And well, no, that's not all I needed. He was listening the whole time. I needed to what did I need? I needed him to feel some of what I was going through. I needed him to validate what I was going through. I needed him to describe, just his describing, in other words, of what I was feeling.
Well, that's a very astute observation, but you've also hit the nail on the head as far as what the definition of empathy is. And it's feeling what another person's feeling. And compassion is wanting to alleviate the person's suffering. And when you give people shoulds, I mean, that's one of the major faux pas in talk therapy. That's one of the first things that they teach you, even prior to going to do my master's, when I was working or volunteering at the Distress Center here in Toronto. One of the first things they teach you is not to try to problem solve. It is about emotional resonance with the caller, with the person in distress. And a lot of literature and research shows that is the preeminent solution to someone in an acute state of distress, is feeling that human connection with somebody. I'm seen. I'm validated. And that's often enough to give the person at least temporary relief from what they're feeling. And so oftentimes if people propose solutions without empathizing, it's like, well, now you're just barking orders at me. You're being authoritarian. And
there's another element that when you keep giving me solutions, you're indicating these are solutions, one, you didn't think of, two, you didn't do already, and therefore you're the author of your own fate. And it puts all the blame and onus of solution. And I think you get it, that often we just want to be heard, but empathized with, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, what makes life as rich as it is in part one of the major legs of the chair, I'd say, is human connection. I mean, we can't really survive without it. Psychologically, we can't survive without it. People that go in isolation for prolonged periods of time, or kids that grow up in isolation, or even other primates that grow up in isolation, don't fare so well. They're really developmentally stunted, and funnily enough, or not so funnily enough, but interestingly enough, it manifests in physical deformities just as much as psychological arrests.
In getting over your OCD and your exposure to different therapists, you must have, something made you want to pursue this there must have been moments where you got something out of it.
I think my greatest gift, I think anybody's greatest gift to the world, well, not necessarily, I don't want to overgeneralize, but a lot of times when you're in the helping professions, your deepest pain transmutes into your greatest gift to humanity, because you understand something at such a visceral level, and you understand how you've navigated those seas. And so you come out the other end with just a perspective like no other. I mean, it's your perspective, so in and of itself, it's idiosyncratic, but it's having lived something as opposed to having read it in a textbook is completely different. So knowledge does not equal understanding.
So let's say I went to a therapist and I have a horrific fear of public speaking. And specifically, I would have a very acute fear of, let's say, trying stand-up comedy. So as a therapist, I mean, are you saying things like confront your fears, put them out of your mind, find what you truly want to do, and if you really want to do that, don't be in your own way? I mean, would you encourage somebody to confront their fears? And again, if you couldn't empathize, if that wasn't a fear or something that you suffered from, you'd have to emulate some kind of empathy.
You don't have to, you don't have to emulate empathy if you haven't been through a particular situation. I've never lost a child, but I can empathize with a mother or father who have just lost their child. It's the emotion that you're resonating with. And those emotions are the same in each human being. They just, again, manifest in their own ways in everybody's life, idiosyncratically. So, in your case,
should you push somebody to do something they're very anxious about? I mean, maybe that's not a good idea.
If they want to.
Well, but they may be.
If they're coming to you with that problem and you ask them point blank, is this what you want to do? Or is somebody coercing you into this? Or is this part of your childhood conditioning where you felt like you're really, at the end of the day, trying to please an idea of mom or dad in your psyche? But if it's your dream authentically and you want to be a stand-up comedian, then confronting that fear is something that you have to do. There's no way around that. So at that point, you sort of, I mean, you're talking to a second-year master's student here, but from my perspective, I think exposure therapy is very common, is a common approach. But
is that a typical thing, confront your fears? I mean, is there ever a point where you got, well, that's a legitimate fear, maybe you should avoid it?
Of course, yeah. I mean, you have to be reasonable, but...
hey, Dave, you're not funny. It's not going to work out.
You know, it depends how you confront that fear, too. Right? People... It's interesting, you know, and I think we talked about this a few weeks ago when we were just shooting the shit, but we were talking about macho men and how people that puff their chests out and hold their chins up high and go around the world like a battering ram are really people that are compensating for deep insecurity, deep feelings of, invalidation, and deep feelings of trying to push away their own weakness and vulnerability is intolerable to them, so they don't allow it up into their consciousness, and so it manifests in macho man behavior. And I think that's what, you know, feminists refer to as toxic masculinity. I think I'd agree with them there. But if you're confronting it while repressing parts of yourself that are intolerable to you, then that's just going to spring up in another guise at some point of your life, and you won't really have overcome the fear. You'll have just supplanted it for the time being. So that may work temporarily, but it's sure to screw you over in the long term.
Yeah, the common pop psychological statement was the force with which you repress something is a force with which it manifests itself in some other way.
Right.
Pop psychology, I mean, in the 70s, it seemed every 6 months there was another bestseller book of a new form of, always paperbacks, and then I guess the last one I was aware of is The Secret. which I find quite comedic. But so it's a positive thinking thing. I mean,
when did that one come out?
I'm just gonna guess the end of the 80s, but
okay,
it could have been in the 90s.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I haven't read it. I was gifted it. I never cracked it. Not that I disagree necessarily with the premise.
I think
of
if
the
you
book.
read it, you'll disagree.
Yeah. I mean, I believe to some degree in the power of manifestation. Whether it happens the way it's written up in that book is, I'm sure, hotly contested or just plain dismissed. But okay. I don't think people really understand what the nature of reality is. I mean, it's one of the topics I'm most interested in. And, what's fundamental? Is it consciousness or is it matter? And I think most people are starting to lean, the scientific community especially, are starting to lean towards immaterial consciousness being the fabric of the universe.
Another pop psychological bestseller was The Inner Game of, and there was The Inner Game of Tennis, there's The Inner Game of a whole bunch. I think tennis was one of the early incarnations. And it's there's some similarities between it and The Secret in that in The Inner Game of Tennis, for example, you're supposed to visualize your goal. In fact, it's very similar to The Secret. And you're not supposed to overthink the things you do to correct your failures. You're supposed to be aware of it and then trust your inner mind to make those compensations. And the argument was then, if you know that you're always shooting a little to the left, if you consciously re-aim to the right to compensate, you'll screw it up if you let your brain. So it's kind of interesting. And so the secret was that you're supposed to visualize what you want, but then stop there and do none of the things that would actually make it happen. But magically, ridiculous. 5 years later, here's an anecdote. So there's a lot of people I've interviewed who I really wanted to meet, and I probably have always had that desire to meet these certain people, and in a lot of ways, I really didn't do anything that would set in motion the meeting of these people, and then just wound up doing this podcast and wound up meeting those people. But I didn't consciously. So in a way, I secreted.
I mean, that's interesting. I think you could call those synchronicities as well.
That was a joke. I secreted. Tough crowd.
Sorry, didn't catch on to that one. Might have a future in stand-up yet, Dave. I
derailed your point there.
You didn't know synchronicities. Mind interfaces with the world. I believe, and there's not just linear causality. I think that's a Newtonian notion that is true to some extent, but not the entire truth. And Carl Jung was the first person to talk about synchronicities. He was really ambivalent about it, withheld his observations or took notes for 20 some odd years about the synchronicities he was noticing in his patients in his own life, and then eventually came public with it. Of course, it was totally thrown out by mainstream science and psychiatry at the time as total nonsense. But he was friends with a number of prominent quantum physicists. Wolfgang Pauli, one of the fathers of quantum physics, was one of his patients. And Wolfgang Pauli was of the belief that it was totally plausible given what he knew about quantum physics and non-locality and things popping in and out of existence and particles, matter not having any inherent existence until they're observed, and a number of other observations that are quantum physics is the most accurate science there is, period. So Einstein called it, spooky, because it didn't align with the materialist linear causality view.
So particle wave duality, things being in two places at the same time, probability clouds.
Yeah. So And I think if you look at matter closer and closer on smaller and smaller scales, boundaries just get wider and wider to the point where you're in the quantum foam and then the quantum vacuum, which is all-encompassing and everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. So our brains play tricks on us. I mean, matter is really popping in and out of existence faster than our brains can pick up on, so it gives us the illusion of continuity, but so we can have this experience, I believe, have this human experience. But to say then that the brain creates consciousness and all that there is linear causality are people, I think, trying to suck the magic out of life, and I have a hard time with that approach.
Can we apply any psychology in understanding the political world?
Certainly.
Really?
I think
all right.
Psychology is the basis of politics.
Okay. Diagnose Donald Trump.
You know, we talked about this in class, and I go to school in San Francisco, as you know, and which is the epicenter of Democrat America, really, and the hub of political correctness in the U.S. and probably globally. And so everyone in my cohort is vehemently anti-Trump. Fair enough. We talked about...
Okay, is that even a bias? I mean, I got into this, you know, if I get all my news from MSNBC and I avoid Fox, then I don't think that it's A and B. I think one is true and one is a lie. I don't think I actually...
Which one do you think's the truth?
Well, I'm not a fan of Trump, obviously.
Do you think Hillary's better? Do you think she was a better candidate?
I have problems with Hillary Clinton. When she's... People have suggested she's actually not pro-universal health care, and she's, you know, centrist. She's not a Democrat. She's not liberal. She doesn't have progressive and innovative...
She's a neocon.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. And also puts her hands in a million different pots and does whatever she can to
okay. And the same can be said of Obama.
Oh, absolutely. I'm no fan of Obama either. I find it hard to believe that a person commander-in-chief of the military simultaneously invading 4 countries could win the Nobel Peace Prize. I just find that to be astounding.
Well, he hadn't been in office a few weeks before he was awarded that.
Right.
But the drone strikes and the privacy issues and the things that went on during his reign are, just as bad as any of them. But back to Trump. I sidetracked you. So, diagnosing Donald Trump is one question. Another question is then we have to also diagnose his voters. And that forces us to look at the Republicans who have given him a green light in every way at every chance they could. What can we draw from that? I mean, doesn't a psychopath need a victim? He needs a psychopathic bond. Are the two of them, his followers and him, working together? Certainly the people in his personal circles and Cohen's recent testimony, he can't do what he does without these enablers. But these enablers bask in his glow.
Yeah. As it concerns the diagnosis, my official diagnosis would probably be he's on the narcissistic personality disorder spectrum.
A power broker? What kind of narcissist? There's a bunch of different types.
Well, based on the sort of DSM description, he'd meet a number of the criteria for sure. He's obviously runs the country like a corporation, wherein he's the commander-in-chief. He sort of discredits or disbands people that disagree with him. He seems to be immune to criticism. He seems to be unflappable in ways that are just unrealistic. He obviously doesn't have healthy relationships with those around him. You look at the body language between him and is it Melanie or Melania?
Melania.
just seems like a very odd relationship.
Well, he keeps, I mean, every single person who's worked for him almost in the White House ends up being fired on Twitter. So he can't maintain relationships with people, and he can't delegate and respect their opinions.
Well, that's what narcissists do. As soon as you stop giving them narcissistic supply, then they just dismiss you out of hand, and you're no longer important to them. So narcissists are incapable of empathizing or relating to normal human emotion. They just don't feel it, and it's not their fault. They've had a number of traumas in childhood and grown up with potentially negligent parents, or not given, the love and healthy narcissism that they needed in childhood. And healthy narcissism in terms of feeling validated or loved or feeling like you're on the right track, and you look to your caregivers for that reinforcement all the time. It's really important. So if you come from a family with parents that were negligent, a mother that might have suffered from postpartum depression, or a father who is exceedingly strict, always putting you down or always building you up, it can go one of both ways. It's not an exact science, but you tend to see, if you retrace the steps, typically those patterns will come up. But then again, narcissists were Freud's worst nightmare. They're some of the most resistant people to treatment because they won't show up at the therapist's door. They don't feel pain necessarily. They don't feel the consequences of their behavior. So they just carry on in the world basically unscathed and resolute in their ways, thinking that they're always right, and then just seeking out places where they can get new narcissistic supply. I'm really struggling with that word today. Narcissistic supply once it's been extinguished from one of their sources.
I love the term narcissistic supply. That's a new one.
Yeah, it's a good one.
I heard that one.
It's a good one.
Okay, how do we explain the voters who, no matter what, after 100 years of battling communism, or 100 years of whatever their values were, all of a sudden just turn a page, give them a charismatic leader, and they are all in no matter what he does. And he even said in one of his speeches he could go out into Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, and his supporters would love him. I think he's at 89% support amongst Republicans, and 40%, it dips up and down, but around 40% constant. So no matter what he does, I mean, even after this week, he had that disastrous meeting with Kim Jong. No matter what happens or what comes out or who's convicted, people won't give up on him. What is that? Is that a psychotic bond? How?
Well, I think every racist in America voted for Trump. I think there are people more moderate than what I believe to be now the fringes of obviously the fringes of acceptable behavior in society, but I think less and less people are genuinely racist. I think that's really been pushed out. I think you get socially alienated pretty fast if you espouse those views outside of your own relatively isolated echo chambers.
Well, I'm going to derail you again.
Yeah.
That's a point I've been working on. The theory was that for the last 100 years, people with those views were told in subtle ways, keep it to yourself. And maybe they would speak amongst their family, but they knew that what they were saying wasn't going to go over well. And they were, in a way, isolated. Now that Trump is there to give them all a bandwagon to get on, you've enabled them, which is why you've got the Charlottesville, there's good people on both sides, or we've now normalized that kind of behavior with, is seen in his rallies and the kinds of people who are going for his rallies and his love of racist ideas. Can you put that genie back in the bottle? Now you're saying statistically we are more enlightened, we are a little bit better educated, we are less racist as a society. It doesn't help that 2/3 of us aren't voting, but what about this idea that we've given them a soapbox by providing them with a Trump? And can you put the genie back in the bottle? If we elect a progressive Democrat, let's say, if they elect a progressive Democrat to be the president, will all of this really go away overnight? What permanent damage has been done?
Well, I think Trump's a reflection of the collective unconscious in American society. I think, to your point, those viewpoints were repressed for the longest time, and now they found an outlet for it in the form of a political figure that will sort of be the beacon of those views.
Can you put the genie back in the bottle?
In terms of turning back or pushing back against the racism, well, I think it depends on how much you think racism really pervades. From what I've observed, I think we really have evolved beyond the point that that sort of behavior is acceptable, certainly in the mainstream, and that if you were to espouse those views, you would be ostracized almost immediately, that just people have no tolerance for it.
But even Trump has brought this into the mainstream. It's truth and lies, right and wrong. Like, so if somebody says, oh, you need to watch more Fox News, I'm like, it's not that it's a balance.
Well, bias is inescapable, right? We're all biased, no matter how much we think that we're not. And most people belong to groups, and most people are incentivized by corporations to espouse a particular view or to certain topics that are off limits or certain opinions that are off limits. I think, listening to one, as I know some people do, listen to one source of media and then extrapolate that as the ultimate truth, I find difficult. People that watch CNN and then regurgitate every piece of propaganda that they hear on CNN and espouse it to be true. It's like, hold on a minute. Like, who are you hearing this from? Who subsidizes them? What are the interests of the media outlet? Like, you have to dissect all of this.
Well, if the shows on MSNBC you're watching are based on court documents every day, it's not bias or speculation. These are real.
But it's an interpretation of court documents, and, focusing in on one issue, that's fine if you want to talk about it. But what about counterexamples to that example? Right? Look at, hate crimes are said to be at astronomical levels, at least for a modern society in America, like this recent Jussie Smollett case that we talked about. But then there's this other reporter that I admire who works for a publication called Quillette, called Andy Ngo, Ngo. He's Vietnamese. And he recently published a thread on Twitter showing all the fake hoaxes that have been enacted in recent history. People brandishing mosques and painting Nazi emblems on them and so forth, and then reporting it to the news. And it turns out when they do an investigation that it's actually, a Muslim member of that mosque who did it. Or, in Jussie Smollett case, this is somebody trying to, in my view anyways, incite violence against Trump supporters who may have racist views, who may not, who might just be anti-establishment, who might just be middle-class members of Flyover America who are fed up with globalist politics in the U.S. I'm not saying I advocate for them, but I can understand their position.
Okay, you told me about the Jussie Smollett case a couple days into it. Mm-hmm. We've learned a lot since then. Mm-hmm. What did you first think the story was about? And how do you think the story's changed as we've...
Well, my friend, who I have a lot of similar conversations with, sent it to me. And when I learnt of it, again, the information I got on the Jussie Smollett incident was through the filter of Andy Ngo, who's sort of a whistleblower on these hoaxes. So I took that into consideration. I also noticed how many left-wing, or not left-wing, but Democrat politicians immediately jumped on board as a way to, as a platform to fight against hate crimes and use it to brand build for themselves. I also noticed Celebrities, a lot of celebrities were doing the same, who tend to be more open in their psychology, so they tend to, they're prone to empathetic thinking, but I think a lot of left wing or leftism, as they call it today, is empathy gone awry, misguided empathy. Anyways, that's another matter. But so the Jussie Smollett case, I thought the details were obviously a little shady. I mean, he somehow held on to his Subway sandwich and was on the phone simultaneously while getting the crap beaten out of him by two dudes and having a noose put around his neck, which I don't think he realized was on till 5 or 7 minutes later. When he got home, he realized there was a rope around his neck.
What I heard was he showed up at the police station 45 minutes later with it still on his neck.
Yeah, that's good acting.
But haven't we learned since then, or it's at least the police seem to believe since then, that it is a staged event? It's I think pretty much been confirmed. He hired two Nigerian brothers who were extras on that show Empire to conduct the hoax with him. And they paid them $3,500.
$3,500, and but the kicker for me was the fact that he went and did an interview on whatever outlet that was, ABCBS, maybe ABC, one of them, and he was one of the major, Good Morning America, I think it was, and did a 15-minute interview about, discussing the details of the supposed incident, and also saying that there are fear mongrels, MONGREL, which I'd never heard before, fear mongrels trying to separate us in America, and that's not okay. That's a verbatim quote of what he said. And it's just, sort of astoundingly ironic when all is said and done that he's the exact perpetrator of that. He is trying to divide and separate.
Okay. Was that to, as you said earlier, to damage Trump? Or was that because people are speculating he did it to up his status and his visibility?
I mean, there's an element of both. I think he has a messiah complex. You look on his Twitter page, and the first sentence in his bio is, "I am just trying to save the world." And then he, in the second sentence, mentions having love, or love being some sort of dominant force in his ideology. So, funny way of going about that. And so, but yeah, obviously there's an element of brand building. I don't know how good of an actor he is. I have no idea. I've never seen Empire, never heard of him before this hoax incident, so I have no idea. But apparently he was getting written off the show. I'm not entirely sure what was going on, but obviously he doesn't want to fall into irrelevance. So that's, a good way. A hoax that gets national, maybe even international attention is a good way to go about that, certainly.
Yeah, too bad that backfired, because he's probably toast now.
Well, and rightfully so. I empathize with him. I'm sure, again, he's a guy who's experienced trauma in his life and been the target of racism as a gay black man in America. I'm sure life growing up for him wasn't easy. I empathize with that deeply. But projecting your pain onto the world sort of for the rest of your life isn't going to give you peace inside, and certainly isn't going to make things more peaceful around you if that's what you authentically want for the world. So
we're going to find out that there is a mental health component to this, obviously.
I was watching that interview, and I got a very strong sense of, sociopathic, narcissistic traits in him. And I mean, he was crying. I mean, he put on a total acting job for a subject that is very, very serious. I mean, you're talking about major, major repercussions if this is true. So I just wonder, what is your end game here? What were your intentions? Did you was it just unsophisticated? Did you just not think it through and act on a whim? Or are you trying to wreak havoc? And I don't know the answer. Only he does. Maybe he doesn't even know. Another
story that's, I guess, a week old. Okay, and you asked me, have you heard any good podcasts lately? Well, I'm a huge fan of Pete Holmes. So he has a show, Crashing. He's 20 plus years stand-up comedian. He's done a lot of funny and interesting things that you can find on YouTube, like Bad Man, which is a takeoff on Batman. I just think he's silly and yeah. And yet his interviews, I think he's the best interviewer I've ever heard in my life. There's something about his style that takes the guest so deep. People even make fun of, you're trying to go deep, but I've never heard anything like it. Anyway, he replayed an episode from a couple years ago this week because an LA comedian, Brody Stevens, hung himself. And there's a couple comedians who've been quite public about their struggles with mental health. One of them's Maria Bamford, and another is Brody Stevens. I think to the point where I think he had scheduled some kind of special, and then that week had been off his meds and kind of flipped out, and the special turned into other famous comedians, Sarah Silverman and a bunch of the circle of LA comedians he hangs out with, helping him get committed and monitoring his progress through going to a hospital, and it looked at his career before and after. And anyway, so these are people who are struggling with mental health issues. I'm a huge fan of Brody Stevens. He has a special on Amazon, and I watched it, and I was sort of somewhat horrified by it, because it wasn't smooth and fabulous the way a lot of the other specials were. In fact, it really was him, in a way, not bombing, but close to it. And the way the venue was set up, and they had filled a bunch of specials that night, and the audience had been spread thin between 3 specials. And but if you're interested in comedy, then it was him doing his thing, working a tough room. It isn't always, you don't win every time. The job is a struggle. It is difficult. And then when you factor in the fact that he's struggling through his own lifelong severe mental health issues. But if you're interested in the study of comedy, then seeing the reality of it when things are tough. But he's more of a comedian's comedian than a popularly well-known comedian.
Is mental illness, depression specifically common amongst comedians, famous comedians?
I think that you could add the numbers on your hands of the healthy comedians. Mm-hmm. I think to do this podcast, there's got to be something wrong with you. Let alone fighting it out and experiencing the bombing and trying to win the room. And then the highs of when it works and the lows of when it doesn't. The need to constantly express yourself, to do it in a somewhat impersonal way. I think that in order to be a comedian, you probably have a lifestyle that isn't a conventional one. And right there, whether that means you can't really work with other people, or you can't do a mundane job, or you're not satiated with what is, quote, normal lifestyle.
I've heard Jerry Seinfeld say that he can't be friends with non-comedians. He just has no way to relate to people that aren't thinking or framing the world in a similar way to him.
I've mentioned that with a bunch of comedians that I've interviewed, and they all agree. And why would they? We are the fodder for their constructs. We have to be different from them. How could you make fun of us and our mundane, silly little...
And it takes a fair amount of cynicism as well, right, to be a good comedian?
I don't know. There's so many different kinds. Like there's...
An observational comic comedian?
There's clean ones and there's dirty ones. There's mean ones and there's nice ones. There's people who are doing shticks. There are people who are just delivering street jokes, or there's true self and in the moment comedians. There's storytellers who only derive their material from their own painful truths. There's a whole wide range of different ones, but I think they all have to be a little crazy. So I think that would be a statistic somebody should Google. But that's my feeling, is that they're all crazy.
Yeah.
And that's why they're so interesting. That otherwise, how could they have such a different and different take on everything?
Find us on Twitter at @thatarcher, our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Rate the show on iTunes. It changes the way the show is listed.
I had something else I wanted to say about Stephen Brody Stevens. That he could do what he did with what he had to endure and still be kind and generous and happy and up and motivating and energetic, and never took his own pain and struggle and not take it out on other people is really disturbing part of it. You know, had he been a mean person, it would be much easier to. And let me give you an example. Why am I talking about Stephen Brody Stevens? Not only was I trying to get him on my show, I actually had litigated up to the point where we had set a day and time. And that's just another example, like, of his generosity, of his kindness, of his wanting to reach out and share. So, obviously I'm disappointed, but I really liked his style, and people are saying there was no one like him. And part of that comes out of the fact that he started in professional baseball. He was actually an athlete who transitioned into comedy. More beloved, obviously, amongst comedians than the general public. Definitely a weird guy, but totally unique.
Well, what came up for me when you were saying that was oftentimes, two things. One, if you're medicated or heavily medicated and there's no dialogue with another human being around your experience. I mean, it's one thing to medicate somebody to stabilize them, but it's another, and I think which is an unfortunate trend in psychiatry, is to medicate and that be the only form of treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And psychotropic medications have been shown to target the same receptors, essentially be as efficacious as they were in the 50s and 60s.
Huh.
And in certain cases, SSRIs or antidepressants being no more efficacious than the placebo effect, which is about 30%.
Wow.
So that's alarming. And then when you factor in how much they're marketed to people and the incredibly deleterious side effects that they have, and the fact that there are rebound effects. So you mentioned Brody Stevens had been off his medication for a little period and then likely went into a psychotic episode or numbness or what have you and killed himself. When you are constantly, like SSRIs work by stopping the reuptake of serotonin, it's a totally faulty premise to begin with, the idea that depression is caused by serotonin deficiency, completely unproven. And yet it's been marketed for forever. But when you toy with people's neurotransmitters, so these drugs are enhancing the bioavailability or the amount of serotonin in the brain, and then you take those drugs away, there's intense withdrawal effects and intense rebound effects. You get the exact polar opposite of what you've been experiencing for however long he's been on the medication. So you're bound to destabilize somebody. And case in point, it's had a lethal effect on somebody.
And don't you get prescribed these and then 4 months later you've adjusted to them? Don't you then often get sick maybe of the side effects and try a new drug and then start that whole process again of finding the right dosage?
Right. They're constantly titrating dosages and mixing different drugs together. And I've talked to countless people on the phone lines at the distress center about people who have been prescribed cocktails of medications by their psychiatrists, by their doctors, and it's had irreversible damage on them, has handicapped them for life. And the other point I was going to say about Stephen Brody Stevens is he sounds like he was a nice empathetic, kind human being. But if there's no talk therapy component, you're on a daily basis internalizing your pain, suppressing it, not allowing it to come to the surface, not being given an avenue, to ventilate all of that.
And it's possible comedy wasn't doing that. Like, that could just have been a distraction from dealing with.
It could have been. It could have been an inspiration too. But I agree. Obviously, it wasn't. I mean, he's not going to get into his childhood life experiences on stage necessarily,
Maybe
or talk about.
A lot of them do.
Okay.
True self.
Okay. But talk about being abused or neglected or whatever. A lot of that stuff might not even be conscious. A lot of the times it isn't. It happened in sort of the amnesic period, or as an ego protective mechanism, you block it out of your awareness. And oftentimes high dose psychedelics or really deep therapy or holotropic breath work, which is a method created by Stan Groff, who is a professor, is currently a professor. He's like in his late 80s, maybe 90s, and still sharp as a tack at the California Institute of Integral Studies, where I go. He often said that even Freudian, even the study of the unconscious or postnatal experiences isn't enough oftentimes to cure people, to make them better. He also talks about there being experiences during the birthing process themselves which stamp your unconscious and can cause all sorts of challenges later on in life. That you're if it's a particularly laborious labor process, or you're stuck in the womb, or you have your umbilical cord wrapped around your neck and you're gasping for air, or you feel like your mother's pushing and you can't come out, and symbolically you interpret that as like the frustration of meaninglessness in life and suffering. There's all sorts of interesting, obviously this is largely discredited by neuroscience and largely discredited by mainstream psychiatry, but he has countless anecdotes of people who he's helped dramatically with this stuff. He'll even talk about psychedelics, specific psychedelics taking you through past life traumas and so forth. Now, I'm not advocating for that necessarily. I haven't had one of those experiences, so I can't speak to its truth, but he's somebody that I respect immensely, so I'm willing to give it a shot.
I'm sure being circumcised doesn't help.
Well, exactly, right? Like, you're born and they mutilate your genitals almost immediately.
With no painkiller.
With no pain. Like, think about how you interpret that. It's a full-blown trauma. And it's your genitals. It's one of the places, if not the place, with the most nerve endings in your body.
But animals and babies have no feelings.
Right. Exactly.
What I keep thinking there's something more about Stephen Brody Stevens.
Sometimes support isn't enough. There has to be a willingness to change, to overcome it. And oftentimes an intellectual understanding of what you're going through isn't enough either. A lot of times people will be in psychoanalysis for decades and have a very vivid intellectual understanding of what their complexes are, and yet they still behave the exact same way. They're still just as neurotic. And so, that's why sometimes you have to get a little deeper.
A lot of people who have been in therapy for a long time become experts on the various forms of therapy. Do you qualify as a millennial?
Yes, I do. I think I've heard as early as 82 being a millennial, and 95. That sounds like a unusually long generation. I don't know what qualifies as a generation. I know iGen, or Generation Z as they're called now, starts in 95. That would be the internet generation, which is an interesting generation.
Now,
for
if
sure.
you're born in 95 at the sort of beginning of the popularization of the internet, you're too young to experience it. So you would want to be 10 or 15 or 20 when an event happens to be associated with it. So people born before 1990. So that would put you as around 10 years old at the cross of the millennium. Yeah, 1990, 1985. I could see it because then you'd be 15 when.
Right.
So
this book I was reading by Jonathan Haidt mentions the 82 year as the cutoff, which struck me as early, but, makes sense.
Yeah, so you'd be 18 in the year 2000.
Right.
That sounds like a millennial.
Yeah.
Because your cognitive skills are intact and developed by the time you're going through this period of change.
Right.
So let's say you're legally a millennial. A few years ago, so outdated by now and simplistic and overly generalized, there have been articles written that try to describe the generations and differences between baby boomers and millennials and Generation X and Y and Z. Is there anything to that? I mean, obviously stereotypes and generalizations are kind of meaningless. We'll probably agree. But is there any way we can characterize people of different periods?
It's not something that I pay, that much attention to.
Yeah.
But what I find most interesting is this most recent generation, Generation Z, or the I gen, who are...
Is that a thing? I generation?
I gen, yeah, internet generation.
Small I, capital G, right?
You got it. People that have just grown up in the whirlwind of technology and the whirlwind of there being 2-year-olds now when I'm in line at the airport that can work an iPad faster than I can. And it's alarming. There's a school in San Francisco where many of the wealthy tech executives send their children, and it's a technology-free school. So they don't want their kids being exposed to that sort of technology. It's said that Steve Jobs wouldn't let his son play with an iPad, or his child. I don't know if he had a boy or girl, but he wouldn't let his child or children play with iPads. I think he had a daughter, actually, from the movie I saw. And so technology to that degree definitely impacts your socio-emotional development. There's no question about that. Not to mention that these kids are holding screens within inches of their face, or they're being blasted with electromagnetic radiation all day long. They're used as pacifiers by fatigued parents, and I totally empathize with them.
These are, I hate to say this, but I'm flashing back to my childhood because, in the 70s, color TV had relatively recently become color, and that was pretty ubiquitous to see kids 4 inches away from the screen, and probably that's real radiation. Now there's shielding and awareness, but kids literally were, and they were saying the same things: parenting by television, an electronic babysitter. So if we're trying to look at changes, I wonder, is it the same?
But now there's the advent of social media too, which is an added variable and a very problematic one in a number of ways. You look at rates of depression and anxiety in young people these days, in teens and in high school students, and it looks like an Olympic snowboard jump, like a half pipe, like it just goes straight up in one direction. And that the idea is that boys tend to bully each other in such a way that they have a physical altercation and then it's over. And that tends to be the theme in male-on-male bullying. Females tend to interfere with each other's social relationships. It's all about diminishing each other on the social hierarchy. So if you find one particular girl that doesn't fit in with the rest, she's subjected to bullying. She's having her relationships sabotaged. She's the recipient of all sorts of mean messages and images. And then there's no escape from it for her, because she goes home, she's on her smartphone, she's on those same social media platforms, and is exposed to that bullying again. There's no reprieve. Not only that, a major source of pride for women, obviously, at that age is physical appearance. It's a major source of admiration, a major source of attention from the same or the opposite sex. And you go on Instagram now, and there are all these unrealistic portrayals of beauty. I mean, and with photoshopping and all of that. So, and it's a human instinct to compare, despite comparison being the thief of joy. I've realized that exacerbates their negative self-image, and they're inundated with these images, they're inundated with these messages, they're inundated with these unrealistic standards, and so that's likely to ramp up your depression, your anxiety, your sense of self, or lack thereof, not being stable in your sense of self. And you're at a very vulnerable age where you're trying to find out who you are in your teens. And you don't have any firm ground to really put your foot on in most instances. And so, this isn't helping people's mental health, and the proliferation of social media is a major issue in my view. I've gone on a complete social media detox and just keep that at arm's length basically all the time.
And they've admitted that, and in the case of Facebook, they've specifically designed it to be addictive.
Right. I mean, it's the same thing with cell phones, with color screens, with notifications being red, which tends to trigger your dopamine circuitry more. So unconsciously, you're wanting that feedback, you're wanting that positive feedback. So, well, if I spend more time on my cell phone, if I spend more time on social media, I'm likely to up my chances of getting that feedback that I'm craving. So,
and you may need that more because of the bullying, the perpetual bullying.
Right.
So it's an interesting cycle.
Yeah.
So let's say I'm looking at the generations. And so if you were to try to start to compare generations, some of the things you might look at are the technological environment, current values, the economic cycle, and whether it's war or peace. I think those factors would go and help describe a generation, because it's talking about the environment they're in, what their opportunities are, because just in terms of the culture changing, the culture 60 years ago is profoundly different. And all these things would work together to shape. I'm just trying to justify putting people into these groups of what generation they are, and sort of justifying, making descriptions about them based on the times in which they operate.
Mm-hmm.
Too much generalization, or is it silly to say that one seemed to be more willing to work in groups and one less likely, or one has one kind of work ethic and another?
Well, there are temperamental differences.
Huh.
I mean, we're all born with sort of a more or less fixed temperamental foundation to our personalities, to our dispositions. But there is, a fair amount of well, not so much fair amount, but there is some flexibility in that. So whether or not somebody's hardworking, is difficult to assess based on the generation they find themselves in. I mean, it can play a factor. I'm sure there are genetic and environmental influences, and there's a constant dance.
I'm just trying to millennial bash here. Yeah. But it's been suggested that people aren't making the same kind of sacrifices for their work in this generation as they might have in the past. And although that sounds like I'm pointing my crooked old finger, If it was depression times, you can see right away that there would be. If
Well, I think millennials, maybe not as much, I'd say towards the tail end, towards the upper border of the millennial cutoff point. I know for myself, we haven't, especially in big metropolitan cities like Toronto with astronomical real estate prices.
There you go.
And Vancouver and other cities around the world, if you don't work in maybe a handful of industries, if not less than a handful, a couple fingerful, you're probably not going to own any significant assets, at least for a long time. And you're going to be paying astronomical rent. So most of your paycheck is going towards your expenses, leaving you with very few savings at the end of the month.
Debt from education, which are basically, as Joe Rogan would put it, etched into your DNA, even if you go completely bankrupt. I'm not sure if this is the case in Canada, but I know it is in the U.S. I think it is. 10 years.
You can go bankrupt and still be on the hook for your student loans, which is absurd. Obviously, it's some sort of financial scheme that's been carefully orchestrated.
George Bush came in and revised American bankruptcy laws that favored credit cards and banks.
Right.
Because I guess he saw when it might have been coming in the 05, 08.
That and the consumer accounts for 70% of GDP in the U.S. So it's a consumer-driven economy and a debt-based economy. So the idea is perpetual debt, perpetual consumption, and that's the engine that keeps the economy driving. And you can't really divorce yourself from that. You can try to go off grid, you can try to get into cryptocurrencies, but they're all manipulated, and those things might change in the future. But
so we can see how the environment in which a generation grows up can have effect on their values. So if you're a younger person and you have no hope of ever buying a house, let's say in an expensive place like Vancouver or Toronto, it would have all kinds of effects on your values. Maybe you start deciding that, well, maybe relationships are the Canadian dream, whether that be family or whatever form it takes. But it's not the traditional set of values that previous generations who might have said, oh, you're nothing unless you own land, or... So I think there's some generalizations we can make by classifying people by generation.
But I don't think that materialist outlook has really shifted that much. I think people are still largely valued on their professional success, and
the goals of people might change if certain dreams are unattainable.
Right. That's certainly possible.
And it's been suggested that maybe previous generations, because of the hardship of whether it's close to a depression or during wartime, might have been willing to make more sacrifices for certain things, whereas another generation might really value the experience rather than material objects. But, well, okay.
Well, and maybe one of the changes I'd like to see happen is, and this is echoed by one of my heroes, Jordan Peterson, as you know, which is a controversial thing to say somehow, but
you've triggered me.
Yeah, exactly. It's not something that you can state that publicly, and this is probably the most public place I've ever stated it, so there you go. He talks about, and he's often labeled a misogynist and so forth, which is just ludicrous, but he talks about the primacy of professional success being the biggest determinant of whether or not you can look back on your life and feel like you had a successful life or a life that you wanted to live. And he says that that shouldn't be the primary determinant of your life satisfaction, that your life satisfaction should be derived just as much from having a family. And people often talk about, S&P, the disproportionate representation of males amongst S&P 500 CEOs. And Jordan Peterson's quick to point out that those are a tiny fraction of the population who are highly motivated, borderline sociopathic men who can work 80 to 100 hours a week and that be their sole preoccupation and not have time for everything else. And they're highly intelligent, highly competent, highly conscientious. And so that's why they're able to attain those positions societally. A lot of the women that he's a clinical psychologist, a lot of the really high-powered women that he's worked with, women that work in certain law firms and make partner and so forth, reach an inflection point in their careers where they get to 30, 31, 32, and they make partner at a law firm, for instance, and they're faced with the prospect of continuing to work 80 hours a week for the foreseeable future and having to sacrifice everything to maintain that position at the company, or their biological clock starts ticking and they're overcome by a perfectly valid desire to have a child and have a family. And so many of them choose to have families. And so they cut short their careers or go on maternity leave, and especially in a really competitive environment like it is today, where the markets are just virtually every industry is saturated with talent, it's hard for them to re-attain that position after the fact, after they've had a few kids and have been out of the game for a number of years. But that it's perfectly valid to choose to have a family. That is a noble aspiration. Why not? If that's what you feel a deep desire to do, then go do it. It's a very worthy investment of your time and energy. And I have a hard time disagreeing with him. I mean, I think so. I'd love it if that became more of a cultural norm, that motherhood and family making were more celebrated in lieu of professional success being, one of the key determinants of whether you have life satisfaction. And oftentimes people that make a lot of money, you hear this, it's a cliche story at this point, people who have it all, who reach the top of the mountain and have everything they could ever imagine, realize that they still feel vapid, that they just feel empty. And you hear in people that are comedians, celebrities that are suicidal, or Jim Carrey. I watched an excellent documentary, you might have seen it on Netflix, about his playing Andy Kaufman. And he talked about that time when he could play Andy Kaufman and forget about Jim Carrey and the entire narrative that had been concocted around his life. When he could just let that narrative go and just be, that's when he felt the deepest fulfillment he ever felt. And it seems like he's done a fair amount of psychedelics and had a spiritual awakening of sorts, so based on the way that he's talking now. But he claims pretty much explicitly that he's never been as happy and fulfilled as he is now, and he hasn't appeared in a movie in God knows how long.
Well, he's in a
show right,
called Kidding, which is brilliant.
Right. I've heard really good things, and I think he's a phenomenal actor. But anyways, all that to say,
Well, let me attack Jordan Peterson.
Okay.
I don't want to spend too much time on Jordan Peterson necessarily, but and here's my problem is, and you said it, that's an argument that I have a difficult time disagreeing with. And he is a clinical psychologist. Let me ask you this. Some of his views wouldn't do too well in a therapy session. Wouldn't, because they contain some triggers. And so my question is loaded. So we can agree with a lot of his well-reasoned, well-researched, and well-articulated arguments. Wording it in such a way that triggers so many groups, is that to sell books?
No, I think Jordan Peterson is just authentically himself. And I think Jordan Peterson's disposition de facto triggers people. I have a close friend in my program who I sent Jordan Peterson's interview when he was interviewed by Kathy Newman on Channel 4 News in the UK. And, consensus is that Kathy Newman looked pretty damn bad in that interview. She was projecting a ton. She was trying to put words in Jordan Peterson's mouth repeatedly and just coming up really short. It really didn't look good. And yet I sent this to my friend in my program, and she's a very intelligent woman, and she couldn't grasp the fact that Kathy Newman was behaving antagonistically and belligerently, frankly, and was immediately triggered by Jordan Peterson's disposition, the way that he enunciates, the way that his voice, just the way that he speaks, just his mere presence.
Being a clinical psychologist, wouldn't he be aware of his propensity for triggering?
But you're not going to be liked by everybody. And if you're triggered by someone or something, you have to examine your own reaction first and foremost, and not point the finger at the external phenomenon that caused you to become sort of triggered. Examining your triggers is a big part of individuation. It's a big part of getting to know yourself and coming to consciousness, and which was sort of the crux of Jungian psychology. And Jung would often say that whatever annoys you or upsets you in the external world is usually a reflection of something that you haven't dealt with within yourself. So typically, classic examples of parents projecting onto their kids, a child being messy, or a child not working hard enough, or jumping from one particular pursuit to the other, and then a parent castigating them for that, without realizing that that's the exact pattern that they lived out when they were younger, and they're just having themselves, the aspect of themselves that they've rejected, reflected back at them, and that causes them distress and upset, and so they point the finger at the child and not themselves. So that's classic shadow behavior. So as a clinical psychologist, triggers are very important clues as to where parts of yourself that you've repressed, parts of yourself that you're not acknowledging, and it's where your work lies, really. When all is said and done, if you're still human, you're still going to have the gamut of human emotions, and it's okay to get upset at people. Anger is a useful emotion. Anger is important for setting boundaries, for instance. But ultimately, Jordan Peterson being himself, not attacking anybody, seeking truth, and having good intentions in doing so, as far as I can see. If that triggers people, then that's more likely a reflection of them and their own psyches, and not Jordan Peterson.
The one little wrench I'd throw into that is that in the case of triggering groups who've been oppressed, it's really society that's causing the injury. And then Jordan Peterson comes along and seems to be unempathetic about it. But that's probably, yeah.
Well, there's merit to that for sure. There's, but I don't think he's not acknowledging it. I think he wants people to take responsibility for themselves, to take, like in a Jungian sense. And there's no end to victimization or to self-victimization if that becomes your MO. And it's the fast track to resentment and bitterness, and that's often a spiral that people can't escape. And so I would say that Jordan Peterson is sympathetic to and understands wholeheartedly where that comes from, but he playing the victim card, that's why he's so against these notions of intersectionality and groupthink and collectivity supplanting individualism. When you start to identify with a collective, you first of all, become ethnocentric by virtue of that right off the bat, and you see the world as a playground of competing factions, competing for interests. And also, there are infinite ways to interpret the world. There are infinite groups that you could be a part of. And so, where does that game end? And Jordan Peterson often says the logical conclusion to intersectionality or to postmodernism is the individual. Because we're all idiosyncratic and could all divide ourselves ad infinitum into groups, the logical conclusion is we're all individuals belonging to countless groups, and therefore should treat each other's individuals first and groups second. Now, groups are important if you want to share interests, people that you're on the same frequency as, that you can have good conversations with, like you and I are having, that share interests, art groups, sport groups, whatever. I mean, groups, he's not group averse, but valuing the collective over the individual, he would say, is a very dangerous road to go down. And it hasn't worked out well in 20th century politics. In fact, the most oppressive, tyrannical regimes have always been collectivists. If you look at the biggest number of casualties.
Where are you studying psychology?
California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco.
And when you studied psychology in Toronto, that was with the U of T?
Yeah, University of Toronto. I was in conventional psychology for a few years.
Find us on Twitter @thatarcher. Send us an email, archer@twxnet.com. For guest links and contact info, visit our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Find us on Android and Apple Podcast apps. Subscribe and rate the show on iTunes.
I'm Dave Archer.
And I am John Giroux in Toronto, Canada.